So what exactly are we up to in this class? By week 5, that is a question that should arise, correct? Are we learning lists of the elements and constituents of drama or narrative or fiction or the short story or the novel or the poem or some subset of a genre, or not a subset of a genre, the genre boldly at large? We're headed soon to find out something about poetry, of course. No. I mean, you can tell that I have not been distributing, I think you would have noticed, if I'd been distributing lists of generic criteria. We have been interested in generic criteria. We've been interested in specific generic criteria, the drama, the chorus, for example, of the tragedy, right? But we have not been exhaustive. We have not felt that, or I have not felt, and maybe you've noticed this, I have not felt that it is our ambition in this class for you to learn all about the various elements of genre, any particular genre, drama, tragedy. A course in tragedy would be the course in which you would learn all the various elements of tragedy. We're learning, this will be maybe no surprise to some of you who are seniors, I think we have a few of you in the class. We're learning what you already know, right? A lot of it. That there are such genres, there are such elements of such genres. We're also learning something that I think you sort of know, easy to forget, in part because you've internalized it to a certain degree, or you will internalize it, right? And it's something that has to be known, I think, has to be grasped at a certain level, as I'm calling it here, in the more sophisticated and firmer collegiate college level manner required of majors and minors. And what is that? It's that it pays to know about these elements of genre, right? These characteristics of the various genres, these dynamics of the subgenres, these mechanics of the various literary forms. Boy, does it pay. Boy, does it pay when you approach the reading of an individual work of art with some awareness, okay, of the tradition. We're going to get to that down the road here in this class. At this point, we're just looking at the genres themselves, not so much the tradition of what's been said, but the kinds of things that have been said, that have been written, right, and established. Boy, does it help to know a little bit about those dynamics, okay, those mechanics, the elements, of course, that in fact dynamically, okay, are present to us as we read a play like Trifles, right? I'm not going to go back to Trifles. Rather go to the plot-story distinction for a good example at this point, though there are numerous such good examples. What we've been doing up to this point in the course is accumulating good examples of these various elements of mostly drama up to this point. Now we're with fiction and narrative, right? These various elements that knowledge of which tremendously enhances the reading experience, okay? And the experience of understanding literature and the experience of appreciating literature at its, at a higher level, at a level that is to be expected of educated people who've been to college, okay? And especially when they're English majors and minors, although I think that the kind of thing we're doing in a class like this is, has a more general kind of application, perhaps, but we won't get into that right now. The plot-story distinction offers a good example. To be aware that such exists, simply that very sophisticated readers, okay, although the distinction doesn't depend upon your being sophisticated. I think even if you're not very sophisticated, at some level it's working on you, okay? You're just not aware enough of it for it to really be of much aid to you. This distinction, okay, that has been of such importance to, let's call them more experienced readers, okay, of narrative, to be mindful of it as we read is to put ourselves in a position to see certain things that we're otherwise not going to see, okay? And just, again, this is just one example. This is the plot-story opposition. When you're aware of it, are you not more aware than you otherwise would be of the question of causality? The plot-story opposition then foregrounds the matter of causality. Well, y'all think so. For example, Mac notes how story summaries tend to offer more detail. The and then, and then, and then. The difference between a plot summary and story summary is, quote, whether or not you're discussing the entirety of a story or just the main points. Are you even discussing when offering story summary is a question that arises. Emily quotes Mullen. Story deals with just, quote, the material of events and characters, what happens. It offers a bullet-pointed list, as Audra puts it. Kyron notes that story deals with just the format in which the plot takes place. John Novak agrees. Story sticks to, quote, objective form. A story summary could be, a widow dies from a heart attack after learning her husband passed away in the workplace. Objectively, this would be true, John adds, but it still leaves out important details. Details of the how so and wherefore, why for. Gabrielle in her plot summary properly gets into just those details of causality or causation, the, quote, reasons for actions, as opposed to just the actions themselves baldly stated. Quote, this X, never mind what, in this moment, causes her to become overwhelmed with joy, unquote, as opposed to simply recounting narrative sequence, which is what story does. Quote, she then becomes overwhelmed with joy, the and then, and then, and then. Mac, she dies of, quote, the realization that she no longer has control over her life. Nolan, quote, after seeing her husband, Mrs. Mallard dies because of her newfound freedom. Because her newfound freedom is stricken from her and her heart gives out. Turning that into a story summary, it would be after seeing her husband, Mrs. Mallard dies, right? Her heart gives out. You wouldn't get into the how and why. Plot is interested not just in the things that happen as they happen, but in the how and why. One thing, whether factor or effect, leads to or follows another as a result. It is interested not in the sequence of events in a narrative, but in their links. In what Denise, quoting Mullen, calls the chain of events. You feel that tug of the chain of causality, as you do not in a story summary. Again, we have a word for all that, causation, Forster's word, causality. Note in passing Joseph's suggestive distinction, quote, the story is what makes the narrative move, and the plot is what makes the reader think. And I like what Joseph is doing there because he's getting us close to this issue that I think relies upon plot summary, relies upon a sense of plot, which is theme. We're going to get to that very shortly, and that's going to be something we'll be taking up in subsequent weeks. Either way, I'm impressed with your subtlety of response to Forster's simplicity. A helpful simplicity, but a simplicity nonetheless. Is story not at all interested in motivation, in the why of an event? Isn't it rather a matter of emphasis? Story is more interested in what than why. Plot is more interested in why than what. This is just a minor clarification of what we're saying and should not be seen as a critique of anything that you have said, because we really do need to tease out the differences between story and plot before we go about qualifying and saying that, hey, it's hard to do a story summary without at least, here and there mentioning some sort of little causal detail. And I think that that's true. I think it's really more a matter of emphasis, but the distinction itself is extraordinarily important, right? And an understanding of this distinction between story and plot is absolutely crucial, even if in the end you're aware it's really more of a matter of emphasis than it is of a complete discrepancy in identity. As I go on to say, it is wrong to say that story summaries don't make any mention of motivation. They do. Quote, she found out her husband was still alive and was so happy that she died on the spot. Note how the why is mentioned in passing. See, that's a distinction. It's not omitted entirely necessarily, even as emphasis is on what happened as opposed to why. So in other words, I don't want you seeing a summary that, in passing glances at the why, okay, or the how or the wherefore or why for. And just think that, okay, well, since it glances at the why, there's no way that I could call this a mere story summary, okay? A proper plot summary is going to plumb the depths of the why, whereas a summary that we could just describe as a story summary is one that's going to not get into it much at all, really just give you kind of a sequence of events, not get into the causal chain. Note how a student in a previous semester of this course, I thought rather rather strikingly portrayed awareness of this refinement of the Forster principle. This is what she wrote. Quote, looking at the ending line, when the doctors came, they said she had died of heart disease, of the joy that kills. Without the context of the rest of the story, a reader would think that Mrs. Mallard learned her husband died and was so overjoyed to discover him alive that she passed away. As this student put it, the plot, however, disagrees. The plot and story at the end of this story, at the end of this little narrative, plot and story come into sharp conflict. The plot, however, disagrees. It begs to differ. That's put so well. Plot and story often disagree in the sense that they don't coincide. Here in Chopin, we have disagreement to the degree that they quarrel. The story, so busy telling us what, says that she died of joy, glancing at motivation and settling for a sense of causation that is really pat, conventional, and inaccurate, right? Joy of the intensity that can kill, right? So we walk away thinking, here's where we get into this whole issue of theme, as I mentioned a moment ago, and why it's so important to have this distinction between plot and story in our brains, right? We walk away thinking, I learned something about joy. This is if we don't plumb the plot. We walk away thinking, oh, today in reading Chopin's story, The Story of an Hour, I learned something about joy, about human joy, just how intense it can get. It can get so intense that it can kill. I am so excited to see what happens that I might miss a detail. That mode of joy ascribed to Mrs. M, it's ascribed not by the narrator, by the doctors, by the way, if you look very carefully. I got caught up in the story. I didn't stop and think. I didn't stop and plumb the plot. Well, what if we read for the plot as opposed to read for the story? Well, I walk away thinking, having slowed down a little bit, notice that this motive of joy is being ascribed to Mrs. Mallard by the doctors and not by the narrator. I walk away thinking, really thinking, joy, schmoy, it's disappointment that does the killing here, as a number of you said, and as I mentioned up above, quoting a couple of you, it's disappointment that does the killing here, not joy. Excuse me. Or one could say disappointed joy. Okay, so we could keep joy a part of the equation. But I now decide that to explain what is happening, we really do need to move past intensity, the question of quantity, to sort. It's the sort of disappointment of joy, once it arrives at a certain intensity, that is at issue here. Disappointment of one's hopes for the future, this joyous anticipation of freedom, really is what kills, right? Reconfinement subsequent to that taste of freedom, of the promise of freedom, is what can kill. That's what the story is about. Not simply that human joy can become so intense that it can kill, and all the circumstances of the joy and the kind of joy, right, doesn't matter, right? The disappointment of that joy doesn't matter. It's just simply because we don't see, when reading for the story as opposed to the plot, we don't see it as the end of the story as disappointment. We see the ending of the story as, in fact, a culmination of removal of disappointment, if anything, right? And the culmination of a process of grief that has suddenly been interrupted and turned on its ear. So it's almost as though it's a story we read just for story about the danger of human emotion, not even just joy. Just intensity of emotion kills you. When one strong emotion turns into a different strong emotion, you die. That's not what the story's about, right? And when you read for plot as opposed to reading for story, you see that, right? Reconfinement, subsequent to a taste of freedom or the promise of freedom, can kill. So necessary to human existence is freedom. That's what the story's about. What story told us was a short fiction about the power of human joy. The plot tells us is truly a short fiction about our need to be free. Okay, enough on this. Enough of this? Not so fast. A couple of slightly different but not discordant themes. These are not themes that are in conflict with the theme that we just discovered by means of a plot-wise reading. They are slightly different themes that seem to accord with this theme that we just discovered. These themes also emerge from a plot-wise consideration of Chopin's Story of an Hour. Note how Joseph identifies a slightly different, if not discordant, theme by noting what the supposedly grieving Mrs. Mallard sees as she looks out of the window. As John A. notes, such details are crucial clues and hints. He's quoting Forster. Here's Joseph, quote, and he's quoting in the first sentence here, he's quoting the Norton, he's quoting Chopin. She could see in the open square before her house the tops of trees that were all a quiver with the new spring life. The delicious breath of rain was in the air. This is what she sees when she looks out of the window, okay, by herself. There's more written, Joseph continues, and described about the springtime, in addition to what was just quoted, a time where a sense of freshness and beginnings are usually viewed. This relates to the plot, continues Joseph, because it is the sense of freshness, because it is the undertones of what is really being mentioned. Mrs. Mallard feels free for the first time, and she's seeming to enjoy it, unquote. To what Joseph here says, I would add only that Mrs. Mallard is coming to self-knowledge, and she's doing so by observing her own authentic, unmediated vision of the world. She's seeing how she now sees, having escaped the conventional expectations of how she is supposed to see according to those around her. As you can tell, I think it matters a lot that she's alone at this point. She has this moment only when she is alone and when she's escaped these expectations, these conventional considerations and solicitudes of those around her. After all, she is just now a widow, as far as they know. Well, what emerges from this is, again, one of these slightly different but not discordant themes. It's called the virtue of solitude emerges as a theme, as does the falsifying pressures of social expectation and convention. These two seem to fit together pretty well. I'm going to repeat that. The virtue of solitude here emerges as a theme, as does the falsifying pressures of social expectation and convention. And I would argue that these two, really the same theme, fit in real nice. They're not to be identified with this issue that we talked about, or this theme that we delineated on the last plate, right? Which is this theme of that you get by way of a plot-wise reading of the story. It's not a story about the intensity of emotion so much as it is a story about a disappointed freedom, right? And the necessity of freedom. That fits in very well with this business about solitude and the falsifying pressures of social expectation and convention, even though I think it's enough different that it should be distinguished as such. Another such, by the way, different if not discordant theme, and this is a student in another section, although some of you got into this issue on the quiz, and I think I could have quoted one of your quizzes to the same effect. Men and women oppress each other, even if it's out of love or kindness. This, of course, is the quiz item that had to do with the feelings of the husband, Mr. Mallard, for his wife, right? He seems to really love her, doesn't he? She finds that love oppressive, right? So we get this complex and interesting little theme of love. Men and women oppress each other, even if it's out of love or kindness. Love and freedom. This is how we can maybe put these themes together. Love and freedom can be at odds. Not always do we, when loving a thing, set it free, okay? Is the way to maybe state this theme more abstractly. And here's a yet further abstract statement of the theme. Chopin's story is a story about love as well as freedom, and about individuality as well as love. You have more to do this week than usual. I'll make this video unusually brief accordingly, and I will bet that I will not get a lot of complaints about that. Well, we still need to talk about plotters, which means we still need to talk about Poe. Montresor, for example, is obviously a plotter, but so is Poe. And Poe's plot is not equal to Montresor's plot. Montresor plots against Fortunato. Poe plots against Montresor. Montresor's a real character, you may feel. He's a cool cat. He has style, that business with the trowel, for example, which he pulls from underneath there, out of his sleeve. It's like a rabbit out of his sleeve. But you also may feel that he doesn't have any depth. And I know that Audra wrote on this. I think Audra might have been the only person who did so, and I thought she wrote very well on it. So I'm going to share down below her entire comment. I'm going to read it now aloud. Like Sparks, Muriel Sparks, if you go back to the original question, you'll see she's quoting something that I quoted from Sparks. Like Sparks, I think Poe, quote, denies us any moral center. Neither protagonist nor antagonist, Montresor nor Fortunato, is subtle in his motivations. While specifically referring to Italian vintages, our narrator says, quote, in this respect, I did not differ from Fortunato materially. But he doesn't differ from Fortunato in personality either. And I thought that was nicely said. Both of them are full of their own ego and ideas, and they are the most just and correct party, while their narrator might be the most immoral at the moment. After all, he's the one doing the killing, plotting a very thorough murder. His narration implies Fortunato has been nothing but horrible to him for ages, and Fortunato doesn't endear himself to anyone in the audience with his greed to find that cask of Amontillado and never let anyone else enjoy it. Lucchesi cannot tell Amontillado from sherry. Just like Spark, Poe is particularly attentive but hardly sympathetic to the varieties of human vanity. In other words, we have a rather simplistic and simple view of a simple motive, Audra's arguing. And the simple motive is just egotism and arrogance and nastiness. And, in the part of Montresor is really no different, really, from Fortunato. Fortunato just happens to have been luckier. And that's why he's not the one doing this at the end of his story. And in being so, Audra continues, in being attentive to human, but not sympathetic to human vanity. And it's just vanity, nothing, not even so rich as pride. He invites us, the audience, to take both characters, but especially Montresor, who's in question, at face value, removing the, quote, virtue from the story. And that's, of course, a reference to how the stories some stories are defined, if you go back to the original question, as virtuous to the extent, this is what we tend to feel, to the extent that the characters in the stories have depth and have complexity and seem to be imitations of real human character. Well, to go back, Montresor is a real character you may feel. He's a cool cat, he has style, that business with the trowel, but he has no depth you may also feel. And I've just suggested that Audra, I believe, feels this rather keenly. I'm wondering whether that's right. Do we not become aware of certain depths to the extent that we read for the plot? Reading plot-wise, we stop and ask, why is he telling us this? Wait, who is he telling this? You who so well the nature of his soul. Do you remember that from the very beginning, towards the very beginning of the story? Who was that? Why include certain details easily missed when we read for the story, for the what of the story? How he answers, for the love of God, and then waits impatiently for a reply. Right? For the love of God, Montresor. Why? Why does he do that? Depth of motivation emerges as we read plot-wise. Reading plot-wise enables depth of motivation to emerge. Character emerges, real character. Montresor recalls feeling sick at heart as he finishes his job, but quickly adds, as if feeling the need to control his auditor's understanding, it was due to the, quote, dampness of the catacombs. Do you think he feels sick for some other reason? What's his motive? He's telling this story so many years later, and it's so vividly recollected by him that it is communicated in great vivid detail. What's his motive? What's his motive for not necessarily not just the original act, but everything since then, which is hanging on to this story for so long and telling it when he does? Poe does not deny depth or complexity of motive, I would say, in the end, or at least a feeling altogether, so much as merely gesture at it. Gesture at it and not clarify it. Okay, well, that's enough for this week. Good luck on your little paper assignment, and I will see you again soon.